KDKR programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, does the media have it all wrong when it comes to real estate? Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for Prudent Money. Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, can you believe the media when it comes to their interpretation of the real estate market? Mortgage consultant and Prudent Money contributor Mark Pfeiffer is here today to weigh in on this. Hey, Mark. How's it going today?
Cannot complain, Mr. Bob. Thanks for having me, as always.
First, let's talk a little bit about how the media is characterizing what is happening with the real estate market today. What is their conclusions?
Well, there was a report earlier on a very popular news, very economic stock-centric show where they have a person on there who's been saying that the sky's falling, and a report came out for this month's, month-over-month change, and we were up 0.3, which is a good thing, right? It's been a few months of negative, some small negative numbers. And you thought the sky was falling. They said, it's only this. It's only this. You and I have talked about it many times. Negativity, sells, right? The negative headlines, that's right. What gets the eyeballs on the paper. But, Bob, I saw stats this morning that I sent out year over year. Depends on whether you want to look at Case-Shiller appreciation or maybe FHFA, which is like Fannie Freddie. Year over year, depends on which one you want to pick, but we're up 3 to 5% in appreciation year over year. So, again, this housing market crisis or whatever it is, look, are we down? Yes, we are down literally 3% from the peak of 2020. So as far as, the headlines, if you'd ask anybody off the street, how's the housing market? Oh, man, it's crashing. Again, we're just not seeing that, but the headlines would make you think otherwise.
So you've obviously seen the markets in various forms. You saw it when it was really hot. You've seen it when it's slow. How would you characterize, and we'll just talk about mortgage creation business? So, and by the way, let me I'll just to kind of hit on that plus where we are now. So again, this is a tale of two halves in the sense that the graph I saw, I want to say it was the Wall Street Journal, maybe did an article on it. Austin, Texas, and west. Yeah, there's been some big drops. Everything east of Austin was all green. It was absolutely amazing, Bob. You could literally draw a line down the center of the country, and anything east of Austin has plus appreciation. Even Buffalo, New York, that was a joke in my weekly video I just did for this week. Buffalo's up 9%. Who knew Buffalo, New York was the place to be? But there are places like that. Miami's up. It's even some of those hot spots are still up double digits in appreciation, whereas the California, the Seattle, the San Francisco, San Jose, that West Coast are all down double digits. So Texas here for you and me in North Texas, this market's been great. We got people coming in. And so as far as mortgage applications, are they down? Absolutely. About, I think 30% year over year. But again, that's nationwide. Locally, there's still a lot of activity. The realtors we're seeing now are just super busy. So I think we're setting up for a good spring and summer market here in North Texas. Well, I was talking to a realtor just a couple of days ago. Actually, she's a client of mine, and she was saying, there's still plenty of deals that are going above list price, people making multiple offers. Nothing quite like it was during the real boom time in real estate. And you have to admit that was a really hot market. Probably won't be replicated for a long time. But, I think I asked her the question, well, this is then probably a little bit more normal of a real estate environment. Would you agree with that?
I think so. So, for example, it's all pockets, right? So, for example, somebody's selling a house in the middle part of Dallas where there's just not a lot of homes for sale, good school district, all that. And they had, I think, 22 showings in their first day on the market and then 5 offers that night. And so it sold over ask. That's not normal in this market. But to your point, there are pockets where that's true. And certainly there's the opposite, right? I'm sure somebody can give me an example of
how their homes. I know somebody that's more on the outskirts of the Metroplex, and their house has been sitting for about 45 days, right? And so they're freaking out, saying, "Oh man, what do we do?" I'm like, "Guys, the normal market's 4 months on the market. Like in a quote normal market, it's 4.2, 4.3 months on the market for a home to be sitting. So the fact that it sat there for 45 days is what, maybe 5 weekends, 6 weekends.
Sure.
So it's funny how we've all just become conditioned and warped, maybe a better word, as far as what your perspective of reality, thinking that your house should just fly off the shelf. I mean, it's only 4 or 5 weekends. People need to get out there. So I think, to your point, though, it is normalizing. It's a normal market. Even the mortgage folks of the world, the real estate professionals of the world, we kind of joke, like, we got to go back to actually, like, working again and not just order taking. But, yeah, I think it's a good market. I think Dallas-Fort Worth is a wonderful place to be. Everybody wants to be here just from an economic, demographic, geographic, political. Like, Dallas-Fort Worth is a great area to be for that reason. So there's a lot of folks still moving to the area.
So could you take a look at the market and say that it all comes down to one problem? If we had lower interest rates on mortgages, we would be doing this, but we have it at these levels, so we're only doing this. I mean, does it really just come down to mortgage rates, or is there more factors that are as significant?
I'm surprised. So I've been doing this for 20 years, and I know we talk about it whenever these kind of swings happen. It is amazing. It's like the listeners out there, they're paying attention. They do watch the news. They do see things, because when rates drop, the activity does pick up. So certainly that does drive demand. And there's no question, right? Math will tell you that a year, now it's 14, 15 months ago, when rates were at 3 versus now rates in the 6s, call it, I think FreddieMac.com shows like 6.3, 6.4 today. But there's no difference. There's an affordability issue between a 3% interest rate and a 6%, right? That's hundreds of dollars of difference. So that is the part where I kind of scratch my head and say, how does this get fixed? Whether it's locally or nationally, how does this get fixed? Because with the run up in housing prices, like we just talked about, they're still going up, and there's still a shortage of homes. Like, there's still less than 1 million homes for sale in America. And by the way, of the 980 that are available, you figure about a third of those are still under construction, and you can't even move into them.
Right.
So there's still a shortage of homes out there. And so that, I don't see prices coming down just from a supply and demand, but certainly demand gets dampened whenever rates are at 6 and they hit 7 in February. So it is amazing that if we do see inflation come down, which I think we will here in the coming months, I don't know that tomorrow's report is going to show anything. I think it'll be flat. But I do think inflation will start coming down, which then will make our mortgage rates come down. And with all this goofiness of all the bank chatter, if that does send us into a deeper recession, that just means rates come down further, which I think then just continues to spur on and puts fuel on the fire. So I feel for the first-time buyers or the folks that just want to get into a home. And, when your average price point home here in Dallas-Fort Worth is pushing $400,000, it's just tough when you're, when you're a family trying to be a homeowner.
Let's talk a little bit about the Fed. And I want to keep from getting into a discussion about what they're taking the right or the wrong approach, because that could end up taking up the rest of the time that I have with you. So I'm curious, though. It's hard not to go there, but I'm curious if the Fed were to back off on the tightening of interest rates and say they raised interest rates a couple of more times at a quarter of a percent a time, something that barely moves the needle. What implications could that really have on mortgage rates, or does it just not work that way from the standpoint of raising or lowering the lever, so to speak?
Yeah, and I agree with you as far as getting in with opinions, right? So we all have them, I'm sure, but the reality is, I will always say this: they're privy to far more knowledge than I'll ever have available or want available to me. Right, and I can't imagine the scope of what they have to deal with day to day. So I do respect that they're doing what they believe is best. So to answer your question, what impact does the Fed raising rates have on mortgage rates?
Well, if they back off, so they raise it a couple of times.
Yeah, whether they keep going up, or they push flat, or they start lowering them. At the end of the day, mortgage rates are really driven by inflation. So the question is, what is inflation going to do? And the Fed is raising rates, have been raising rates to fight inflation. So then the question is, okay, if they keep raising rates, logic would say, but the reality is inflation should come down, because when they raise rates, they dampen demand. It gets harder, more costly to borrow. People stop spending as much. People lose their jobs, unfortunately. So if they keep raising rates, that would help us in the sense that inflation would come down. If they go flat, let's say they do nothing, then it's just, let's wait and see. In the next 3 to 6 months, I do think if they do nothing, I think inflation is going to be coming down anyway. It's already started coming down. So my opinion is that I think moving forward, I wouldn't mind a just wait and see. They say they're data dependent. The problem is anytime data comes out, it's 30, 60, 90 days old. So they can't rely on that data. They got to kind of project a little bit and say, where are they going? And then if they were to cut rates, believe it or not, I don't think that would help us. Because again, if they cut rates, that may spur some spending. That may, it makes borrowing cheaper for companies and individuals. And if they go get money and they spend it, guess what shows back up? Inflation. So my personal opinion, I would like to see them, and again, I'm not criticizing them, I would like to see moving forward, I'd like to see them take a more neutral approach and let's wait and see what the next 3, 6, 9 months brings. Because if they raise it too much, you could end up pouring, fuel on a could-be recession coming sooner. So I hope they don't. But mortgage rates, if they raise them or they stay flat, I think mortgage rates will improve later this year.
Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned a recession, and it seems if you look at the economy, you look at the various markets, everything's kind of gone down a notch, if you will, and not horribly horrible decline by any stretch, but just kind of gone down a notch, and it kind of keeps working its way down. What do you think? How do you think real estate will react? And I don't even know that if we talk about interest rates, because interest rates are so unpredictable. Realizing, and I want to get to the supply and demand question here in a few minutes, but realizing that there is a supply and demand problem. If we had some sort of a recession, even a deep recession, do you think that people just back off from the standpoint of, I'm going to wait a little bit, as opposed to hopping in there and saying, "Boy, I'm fired up, ready to buy"?
Yeah, I think the demand. This is Mark Pfeiffer's obvious personal opinion, right? So that I don't have anything to show for this, but the reality is, I think demand could stay, still healthy in this sense. The fact is, not every single company and every single job in America does poorly in a recession. There's some companies that do better in recessions. So I think there's always going to be a demand. People are always getting married, having kids. People are getting divorced. People are becoming empty nesters. There's always life events that are going to create some demand, recession or not. And in terms of, what hurt us back in 07, 08 is all the foreclosures. Like right now, I think foreclosures are like 0.3% or something goofy, which is like a multi-decade low. And guess what? Americans have never had more equity in their homes than they do right now. With all this run-up of appreciation in the last 2, 3, 4 years, homeowners have gotten rich. So if there is a job loss, if a recession happens, if worst case, they could sell it and have a ton of money to live off of. Like these houses are not financed with 100% no income type stuff. Like these are good, normal, safe mortgages. So I don't see, even if there are homes for sale, I think the demand that's out there can absorb it. Here's the other thing. Institutions now, like big money, is now involved in single-family real estate. People are buying these up for Airbnbs and rental properties, and that big money's there to snatch something up too. So I think there's going to be some demand that just maintains it, even if we hit a recession that says, hey, normally you might see a dip in home prices. Again, I think just generic housing shortage tied into big money coming in. I just don't see that there's going to be this big drop in housing.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the banking industry, and once again, not going there exactly with opinions of what's happening, but just this tends to affect lenders, obviously. Do you see a little bit more of a cautious approach with the uncertainty of banks?
I think so. So So here's what I've seen as of late. At the end of last year, so Q3, Q4 of last year, when things really got tough. Like it was a last year around June, July. Like it was a there was a halt in the market. Like January through June, we'll say, was a great first 6 months of 2020. 2022, 2023, that's when real estate came tough. People just stopped buying, rates hit 7, all this stuff. But at the end of the day, banks were still just making crazy loans and crazy good loans for consumers, but they were all at low rates to where the normal mortgage person, a lot of them, for investment properties, we'd be like, well, good for you to go to the bank. And no, I'm not saying it was all, but it was like a lot of credit unions. And in my 20 years of doing this, that's not really been a big thing. Credit unions are typically meant to help service their members and all this, but they're not real big players, but suddenly they were. So it's interesting to see how this bank thing that's gone on the last 3 weeks, where suddenly now what's happening is these banks were making these really aggressive loans, low interest rate loans, but obviously they got to pay their depositors big amounts. So I think those small banks, I think they are going to get tightened up. You see the headlines scrolling across all the news mediums. They're trying to get more regulations in there to monitor the same way they might have to do the big ones. So to answer your question about how does that affect housing, how does that affect mortgage? Well, again, if you're getting your mortgage from those, you may have to come to the bigger institutions. If you're self-employed and you need those bank outlets and they're now drying up for your lending, that could be a problem, and you may have to sell your home. But I think big picture, all it's done is helped our rates. When that happened, rates went down about, call it half a point, give or take, just because uncertainty drives a flight to quality, and that's what mortgage-backed securities and treasuries are. So who knows? To answer your question, I don't have a good answer as far as what that does long term. I know in the immediate last couple of weeks, rates have improved because of that.
This is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thank you so much for joining me today. I do appreciate it. Mortgage consultant Mark Pfeiffer is here today. If you want more information on Mark, mortgagemark.com is where you would go. Let's talk a little bit about, and this may be a tough question to answer, but I'll throw it at you anyway. The strategy of, okay, well, I've got the right house. It's locked in on the radar. We want to put an offer down on it. We want to buy it, but I hate these higher mortgage rates. So my plan is to buy at the higher mortgage rate, and then as it lowers, refinance it and get a decent or a better rate. I guess the question is, all that looks great on paper, and it's something that is a good strategy, or could be a good strategy. But with all the volatility and the uncertainty with interest rates, which there's a lot of it, how do you know what level to pull the trigger at? Let's say that you got a 7% mortgage, and it drops down to 6 to 5.5%. Do you sit there and go, well, I want it to go down to 5, or I want it to go down to 4.5. That's got to be the toughest decision to make.
It completely is, and that's and it's a no-brainer scenario like that, right? Let's take your 7% you just threw out there and say rates do go to 6, and let's say for whatever reason, by the way, that's not always a no-brainer, but let's just say it is in this example, like, oh man, we should do it. But again, what if you waited a few months, 3 to 6 months? Maybe rates are in the mid-5s. And then if you take the 6, maybe the mid-5 doesn't make sense to refi. Maybe there's not a cost associated with it. So no question, there is no question, that will be the hard part. And as a mortgage professional, that's the hard part with the consumer, to say, yes, Mr. Smith, does a refinance make sense right now? Yes, here's why. Well, then the question is, if we want to wait a few months, 90 days, see what's on the other side of this, what happens? Well, guess what? Nobody can predict the future. If rates go down, sure, you look smart and Mr. Smith gets a better deal. That's great. But what if rates go up and Mr. Smith misses the opportunity to save money for the next however many years? So that is the hard part. And we've started because Bob, you and I have talked about this before. We've already started our campaign just to put radar signals out there to say, hey, look, guys, make sure you do call us to run the numbers. Because if anybody's going to refinance in the next 6 to 12 to 18 months, if and when rates come down, again, like we've always said, talk to a professional you trust, run the real numbers. Don't get caught up in the, quote, free refi. Nobody doing something for free. Don't get caught up in the no cost, whatever it is. Just make sure you talk to somebody that's structuring it correctly. But yes, to answer your question, I go back to the, what do you do if rates could keep coming? Use your best guess, but at some point, you don't want to get too greedy. And if it makes sense, there is a point where you just got to say, I'll refinance and we'll see what happens. So that is the hard part. You can't time the market. So if it makes sense, I always tell folks, look, at some point, you just can't get greedy.
Well, I was just thinking as I was contemplating what you were saying, that could it be because every time you refinance, there's a cost that goes along with it. Could it be that you say, well, if it gets down, which is reasonable that it could get there, if it gets down between 6 and 5.5%, I'm gonna go ahead and refi then. How much further would it have to fall to make sense for a second refi in as little as 4 to 6 months? Or is that even possible?
It is. So I'll give you an example, a real life example. It's my example. So call it 2007-ish, when rates were coincidentally about where they are today. So rates were in the mid sixes, and I was buying a house, and I bought a house, and I bought a house, call it, on purpose, the rates were at 6.5, and I bought it at 6.8. I on purpose paid an extra 0.3 higher rate. Why? Because all the closing costs were paid for. Why would I do that? I had a hunch, and this is 15 years ago, so younger, not as many gray hairs, but I went ahead and took the 6.8. Well, sure enough, 6 months later, rates fell to, let's call it in my example, 6.25. Well, at that time, I then refinanced to a 6.5. On purpose, took again a higher rate, but it was completely free. So even though the savings weren't as dramatic, I still got savings because it was lower rate, but I didn't pay any cost. Why? Because I paid a higher rate. Well, guess what? Rates kept going down, and Bob, within 2 years, I refinanced 3 times, each time at a lower rate with zero cost, because I took on purpose the higher rate, which then covered the cost. So the lenders are willing to do that. Here's what's going to make this market different. Since COVID, those type of options, they really don't exist. I mean, it's rare because of just how volatile the market is. Lenders aren't willing to do that because every time I refinanced every 6 months, whoever took that mortgage lost money. When mortgage companies make loans, they want loans for about 5 to 7 years to make some money because they don't make a lot of money. It's a little bit, a few bucks here and there every month over time, right? It's the interest. So when they don't have that loan for a long time, they don't get it. So with this volatility, again, it's just we haven't seen it because you can see rates in January of this year, hitting the high 5s, low 6s, and all of a sudden in February they're at 7 again. So everybody that did a loan in February of this year at 7.x is going to be prime, if not already getting close, going to be ready for potential refinance if rates just drop a little. So investors are not willing to give those free. That's why I say these free refis, all the stuff you see on the news and all the commercials. It's not like the old days. So to answer your question, what do they need to do? Where does it make sense? Look, people say that half-point drop. Sure, that's a good one. At least make a phone call if you see rates at half-point lower than what you got. Have that conversation. But specifically, the only way to truly know when it's right is to talk to somebody you trust, run the scenarios, and if they say not today, but you're waiting for a rate of X, call me back here. I think that's the only way you can really do it and truly know. But if it's half a point or lower or close to it, even 0.3, call a mortgage professional you like and trust and get a game plan. We've done that for folks we closed last year. It says, hey, when rates hit here, call me.
Okay, real quick, 10 seconds. Is this the reason why refinancing rates are a little bit higher than buying your first mortgage?
Fannie and Freddie changed that to where now that's part of the reason, but yes and no. That's a deeper question for 10 seconds.
I figured that it was. Mark, listen, always appreciate you coming on the program. MortgageMark.com is where you'll find more information. Hey, this is Bob Brooks. If you got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.